Chapter 22. Mopple is important. Tom O'Malley was inspecting his Guinness. These last few days hadn't been so bad. People had wanted to talk to him because he had a story to tell. What a difference it made when people wanted to talk to you. If anyone had asked him what he liked best about Guinness, the colors would have occurred to him first. Black that could often be a dark red or a brown too. Tom had once seen a horse that was brown like that Guinness brown, and the luscious, sweet, white, creamy head on top was irresistible, although he hadn't drunk quite so much of it these last few days. Suddenly, everyone wanted something from him, even though he could hardly remember anything, just his foot meeting something soft and a nasty fright. Odd that now, just when people had stopped asking him so much about it, he was beginning to remember again. It had taken him a long time to understand that the spade really went right through George. Right through him! No wonder he was back in the Mad Boar now, tipping Guinness down his throat. At least I never saw his eyes, he thought. If you don't see the eyes, you're still okay. For the third time in his life, Mopple was at very close quarters with the butcher, staring into his eyes. The butcher stared menacingly back. Without a glass pane between them now, without any mist, just a little smoke. Mopple turned and trotted back towards the ramp. Justice was all very well, but the butcher was the butcher. Silently, Othello barred Mopple's way. "The butcher," panted Mopple. "He'll kill us all. Me first." Othello shook his head. "He's one of the audience, too. The audience never does anything." Mopple squinted uneasily down at the butcher, but Othello seemed to be right. The butcher wasn't moving. Only his big hands opened and closed around the arms of his wheelchair. Heart thudding, Mopple went back to the side of the stage where Maple and Othello were waiting to make their entrance, while Zora had already trotted to the middle of the platform. First, she had to get the humans to understand what it was all about. George. Zora began by imitating George's position at the time. She lay down on her side and made her legs go rigid. A few of the audience applauded, but no one was really scared. Imperceptibly, Miss Maple shook her head. They still didn't get the idea. Zora stood up and tried again, this time with a much more spectacular death scene. As Zora's forelegs slowly gave way under her, while she bleated dramatically, Mopple curiously inspected the humans. So those were the audience. And indeed, they weren't doing anything. But what was going on at their tables was far from uninteresting. He saw any amount of glasses of Guinness, small dishes of human fodder, and strange bowls full of ash. Automatically, Mopple sniffed the scent of the human fodder. Most of it smelled inedible, but over there in the middle of the first table, a sweet, promising scent thread wafted through the smoke. Mopple looked round at Zora, who was now lying on her side with her legs twitching. Plenty of time before he made his own entrance. Mopple the whale took a step towards the ramp. Those were the audience. If even the butcher wasn't doing anything, just think how harmless all the others must be. While all eyes were turned on Zora, who was just drawing her last breath, Mopple put his rag down at the side of the stage and stole down the ramp, stopping right in front of the table with the delicious smell. Up on stage, Zora leaped to her feet again. This time they must have understood. Now it was time for the murder itself. With long, straight, George-like steps, Zora stalked across the meadow, an expression on her face that said, "Get to work, you idle animals." Then she pricked up her ears. An idea. George left the steps of the shepherd's caravan to pay Beth a visit. Maple was standing on the other side of the platform, calm as a wolf, waiting. They greeted each other. Maple looked friendly. She nuzzled Zora with her nose. Beth wanted to make George do something, but George didn't want to. He shook his head impatiently. At this point, Zora's eyes flashed with amusement, as George's had done so often. By now, an idea had occurred to Beth. Maple uttered a friendly bleat, inviting Zora to take some refreshment. Unsuspectingly, Zora dipped her nose in the invisible, unwholesome puddle and drank her fill. As she did so, she squinted surreptitiously at the audience. The humans were sitting there, blank-faced, and only Ham seemed to be really upset. Had they seen through Beth's plan? At home in the flock, there had been alarmed bleats of, "Don't do it, George," at this point. But it was already too late. George had drunk the poisoned water. For the third time that day, Zora performed a dramatic death scene on stage. There it was, a little piece of cake with a fork sticking into it. Mopple had had good experiences with cake. Not quite such good experiences with forks. He hesitated. That was a mistake. The human on the other side of the piece of cake had noticed him. "Hey!" he shouted. "Shoo! Shoo!" And he made sudden movements with his hands that would normally have frightened Mopple. "You're the audience," thought Mopple the whale, and he stretched his neck out to the cake. The human snatched it back from in front of Mopple's nose with a surprisingly quick movement and held it high above his head, where Mopple couldn't reach it. At the same time, Zora's legs twitched in the air for the last time, and then she lay still. Also at the same moment, Tom O'Malley looked up from his Guinness for the first time in quite a number of minutes, saw the shadowy outline of a long shape with a metal implement sticking in it, saw a sheep behind it. Dead? Wasn't that black-faced sheep he'd seen sitting right above the abyss? And beside that one, a black four-horned ram. George's sheep. His foot struck something soft. "George!" howled Tom. Under the table, Cuchulainn, Josh's old sheepdog, whom he had kicked in the side by mistake, howled too. George's name hung in the air for a long time, while the other sounds gradually died down. Something changed in the atmosphere of the hall. It was as if the wind had blown cold air into the mad boar and extinguished a few of the lights. "You sit down, Tom," said Josh in the silence. It sounded stern. "You're pissed. Just you sit down again." But Tom had no intention of sitting down. He pointed to the stage. The sheep, they're trying to tell us something about the murder." "That's not funny," growled a second voice. "Sit down," Josh repeated. His face pale, his nose bright red, Tom looked round the hall. "You sit down again," said Josh's stern voice for the third time. "You've had one too many." He was right. Tom had certainly had one too many. He dropped back on the bench and patted Cuchulainn's head comfortingly. Pissed again. The hall was going round and round, yet only a second ago everything had been perfectly clear. The sheep. It had to mean something, but probably it just meant he was pissed. Yet again, hopelessly. By now, death itself, in the shape of a black ram, had appeared on stage. Othello's entrance was not strictly necessary. No one had seen Zora die. No one who had seen Zora die could doubt that she was dead. But Mopple, Maple, and Zora had insisted that Othello must go to the mad boar too. Othello knew the world. He knew the zoo. They wouldn't have dared to go there without him. So now Othello and Beth were watching the body, both of them greedy for George's human soul. The time came when Beth didn't want to wait around anymore. Miss Maple pushed Zora back to the meadow on the other side of the platform. It was the only part of her scene that didn't look deceptively genuine. For Beth to be able to move the body at all, Zora herself had to help, using her powerful leg muscles. At this point, they had been interrupted during rehearsals by excited cries of, "He's alive! He's alive!" But George Glenn was dead when the sheep launched into their grand finale. Once she was in the meadow again, Zora lay there on her back, rigid. For want of a spade, Maple stamped on her chest with one front hoof. It was a breathtaking effect that had given Zora a few bruises in rehearsals. Death in the shape of a black ram with demonically sparkling eyes was still prowling around the body. Down in the audience, Mopple the whale let his piece of cake go and scurried back to the stage. Suddenly, he was glad he hadn't eaten it. His stomach felt peculiar, shallow, and queasy. Mopple was important. Now came the third and most difficult part of their performance, the scene about Beth. Mopple dutifully picked the smelly rag up in his teeth again and positioned himself close to Miss Maple just in time. They had thought hard about the best way to depict the murderer. Finally, Mopple the whale had come up with the idea of the scent. Of course, there had been discussions, more particularly between Mopple and Maud, about the size of souls, about things, and about the ability of humans to pick up any scent at all. But Mopple had won the day. "Humans have noses," he said. "Large noses, right in the middle of their faces. They must pick up some kind of scent with them. And Beth, well, anyone is bound to pick up her scent. Anyone with a nose." So they had set to work. Maud discovered a very faint sourish smell in the rag in the tool shed, which was not unlike Beth's scent. To make it stronger, they had buried the rag overnight in dirt. They had covered it with chewed sorrel next day, as senior lead ram Sir Richfield had taken on the arduous task of chewing the sorrel. And then they had wrapped it around a recently deceased shrew found by Heather and left it there for some time. The result was breathtaking. Of course, it didn't smell exactly like Beth, but the similarity was close enough for the sheep to identify her without any doubt. It must be good enough even for human beings with their poor sense of smell. Mopple dramatically shook the rag, and clouds of sharp, pungent murder scent wafted through the room. That was the most difficult part. They had the scent, and they had the thing. It was a chain with a glittery pendant on it, just like Beth's. The most lifelike idea would have been for Miss Maple to hang the thing around her neck. They tried that, but every time they tried it, the cross and the chain instantly disappeared into Maple's thick fleece and couldn't be seen at all. So now Miss Maple took the thing between her teeth. It had been hidden inside her mouth up to this point, and went to the front of the stage with it. She carried the little cross up and down in front of the audience. Mopple kept close behind her with his smelly rag. Down in the audience, something stirred. A murmured curse, a clatter, a glass clinked as it fell to the floor. The butcher came thundering up the ramp, with the wheels of his chair flashing in the spotlights. Once up on the platform, he hesitated for a moment. His eyes wandered back and forth between Mopple and the thing in Maple's mouth. Then he shot towards Mopple the whale. Mopple didn't waste a second. He turned and galloped down the ramp. At the back of the stage, the rag still held tightly in his teeth. The butcher was hard on his heels. He could move with amazing speed in that wheelchair. The other sheep watched from the platform as the butcher chased Mopple through the hall, down one aisle, and up the other aisle again. None of the sheep could say whether it was sheer desperation or a brainwave that finally led Mopple to turn into a narrow pathway left free between two rows of tables. As might have been expected, the butcher thundered after him. But it now turned out that although Mopple the whale was a fat sheep, he was still thinner than the butcher in his wheelchair. While Mopple raced on along the pathway unimpeded, the butcher got stuck after going a few sheep's length. The sheep prepared to hear blood-curdling curses, but in astonishment, Ham just watched Mopple go and silently laid his hands in his lap. Mopple the whale, weak at the knees, returned to the platform, where he felt safer among the other sheep. He had lost the rag somewhere in his flight. Mopple cast a nasty glance at Othello. "The audience," he snorted. "They never do anything, huh?" Othello looked embarrassed. They studied each other in silence, the villagers of Glenhill and George Glenn's sheep. No one applauded. Mopple, who was feeling brave again, was disappointed. He had been secretly hoping for applause, perhaps for even more than applause. During the show and under the attentive gaze of human eyes, he had started to wonder what one of those Guinnesses tasted like. The sheep blinked through the tobacco smoke. Zora looked uneasily all round. Smoke filled the hall like an unpleasant fog, and somewhere in that fog a beast of prey was preparing to pounce. But no beast of prey pounced. At first a few voices were heard in the back rows, where the tourists were sitting. Questions, quiet laughter. Someone stood up and pushed Ham back to his place. Soon the whole hall was humming like a beehive. The moment when everyone's attention was on the sheep had passed, and still justice hadn't put in an appearance. The bespectacled man, who had called Othello Satan, climbed up on stage again. The sheep fled down the ramp at the back to get away from him. Once there, they regrouped to watch. "Let's hear it for Peggy, Polly, Samson, and Black Satan, who have just shown us that even sheep know something about the modern drama," said the bespectacled man. "Give them a big hand." At best, the applause was half-hearted, but the sheep had a feeling that it was more for the bespectacled man than them. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have just seen the most talented and clever sheep in Glenkill do their turns to win your favor. Now it's up to you to..." Right at the back of the hall, something moved. Beth came slowly walking down the central aisle past the audience. In her hands, as tenderly as a mother ewe, she held the rag that Mopple had dropped. Beth had unfolded it, and even through the dirt the sheep could see the pattern of two red signs on a white background. Beth made straight and undeterred for the stage, as if following a secret scent. She walked so calmly and held herself so upright that it was a pleasure to watch her. She stopped in front of the stage. The bespectacled man looked down at Beth. "Excuse me, please," said Beth, "but I'd like to say something." "Does it have to be now?" the bespectacled man hissed. "Yes," said Beth. The bespectacled man shrugged his shoulders. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his voice again, "there will now be a brief intermission for a charity appeal." His hand sketched a gesture of invitation, but Beth didn't join him on the platform. She simply sat down on the edge of the stage and smoothed out her skirt and the piece of cloth she held. "George," she said, "I want to tell you something about George." From then on, it was so quiet in the hall that you could have heard a pin drop. Neither the bespectacled man nor the sheep had really mastered the knack of getting everyone's attention. Beth did it with the utmost ease, yet she didn't do any tricks. She just sat still on the edge of the stage and spoke. Sometimes she swung her legs a little. Sometimes her fingers carefully stroked the piece of cloth. The piece of cloth seemed to be important to her, although it stank. At first she didn't talk about George at all, but about herself. "I gave him this," she said, "long, long ago. It was so easy. I sat up for a whole night embroidering it. I knew in advance just what it would look like, and in the morning I felt as if I could float in the air, do anything, say anything. It was..." Beth hesitated for a moment, perhaps to recover her voice, which had grown quieter and quieter and was now in danger of fading away entirely. It was good. Some of the people began to murmur. And then the moment came, and I didn't say anything, for, after all, just put the handkerchief in his hand without a word. He looked at me as if he didn't understand, and I couldn't say anything or do anything ever again. When I saw it again just now, I realized that that was a big mistake in my life, not the other thing. The sheep could see a shudder run from the nape of Beth's neck down her spine and into her limbs. The Sunday before last, late in the evening, there was a knock on my door. I was still awake, so I opened it, and there was George. I started telling him something about the gospel, like every time we saw each other. I always talked about the gospel. Beth sadly shook her head. But this time it was different. Beth, he said very gently, stop that. This is important. I would tweak at the knees because he said it so gently. So I stopped, and he came into the room. It was almost the way I'd imagined it back then, but of course he had something quite different in mind. I've come to say goodbye, he said. Of course, I said, and I smiled bravely. At least it seemed to me it was brave, but now I know it was cowardly. Of course, Europe calls. No, he said, not Europe. I understood at once. It was almost good that I understood what he meant so quickly. Then he told me why he'd come to me. I didn't remember exactly what we said after that, except that I begged him again and again not to do it. But he was stubborn. He was always so stubborn. Beth's thin fingers traced the line on the dirty piece of cloth. But you were looking forward to going to Europe so much, I said. Yes, he said. I was. I'd still like to go in a way, but I'm afraid, Beth, I can't do it. It's so late now. By this time, Beth was trembling so much that her fingers couldn't follow the lines on the cloth anymore. Now her two hands were clutching each other in search of help, clasping and stroking one another to calm themselves down. I couldn't give him the courage to go on, and then I even helped him do it the way he wanted, when I thought that otherwise they wouldn't bury him. Beth's voice had lost its way in a wood and stopped for a moment, trembling. I'd have gone with him, but he didn't want that. In an hour's time in the meadow, he said, I'll have it over with by then. And I went in the pouring rain. He was dead already. If I can't do that for him, I told myself, well, what's it all worth? Beth smiled, with tears in her eyes, and the sheep were surprised. But then the smile seeped away like rain in the sand. Oh, she sighed, it was hell, and the days afterwards, everything about it was wrong, such a sin, and yet. Boy, asked a hoarse voice from the front row, almost a whisper, but clear and distinct in the tense silence. For the first time since she had begun talking, Beth looked up. Why, look that, croaked Ham, even more quietly. Beth looked at him, irritated. I don't know why, but it absolutely had to be the spade. That'll give him something to think about, he said. I couldn't persuade him not to do it. It was terrible. Ham shook his head. Not the spade. George. Was that so hard to understand? Said Beth. Suddenly she looked angry in a vulnerable sort of way, like a young mother ewe defending her first lamb. When I gave him the handkerchief, I felt the same. Sometimes your hope is so great that you can hardly bear it, so your fear is even greater. He'd waited for Europe too long. Perhaps he simply didn't have the courage anymore to see if he could really do it. But, however, Beth didn't let him go on. And is that so surprising? Was I the only person around here to notice how lonely he was, always lonely, just him and his sheep. Of course, he always laughed at me, but I noticed him moving away from everything, step by step, moving on and on towards something black. The sheep glanced uncertainly at Othello. Their lead ram was looking baffled. Beth sighed. Ah, it's been going on so long. 7 years ago, when I came back from Africa, it was really bad. I don't know what had happened at that time, and I don't want to know. But since then, he didn't get on with anyone here, or with God either. At first, I thought it might be something to do with me, with my absence, but that was vanity. I said so much to him, but he wasn't really listening. And the one thing I always wanted to say, I never did. It's quite easy now. It sounded as if Beth and George had been talking about George's death. But how could George have known he was going to die? And why didn't he run away if he knew about it? What Beth was saying made no sense. They understood the words. They were simple words, words like life and hope and alone. But they could make hardly anything of what Beth meant by them. A point came when the sheep gave up. It was such a strain concentrating on the words when they couldn't understand their sense. After a while, Beth's voice was just a quiet, sad melody to them. Baffled, they trotted back into the dark to join the other sheep in their corner. So, who did murder George? Mopple asked at last. No one answered. Then the sheep heard a snort. Fosco was standing behind them. His eyes were shining almost too brightly, and his breath smelled peculiar. George, said Fosco. None of them reacted to the strange echo. Then Zora asked, very slowly and carefully, You mean George murdered George? Exactly, said Fosco. But George is dead, said Zora. George was murdered. Right, said Fosco. George murdered himself? Right, said Fosco again, suddenly looking very impressive and gray. She's telling lies, bleated Mopple, who had carried the smelly rag all the way to the mad boar to clear up the murder of his shepherd. She just doesn't want to admit that she did it. But the sheep could tell by the scent of it that Bible-bashing Beth wasn't telling lies. Not in the least. Is that crazy? Asked Zora. No, said Fosco. It's suicide. Suicide. A new word. A word that George couldn't explain to them anymore. They sometimes do that. Humans, I mean, said Fosco. They look at the world and decide they don't want to live. But, pleaded Mopple, living and wanting to live are the same thing. No, said Fosco. Sometimes it's different with humans. That's not specially clever, said Mopple. No? Asked Fosco. There was a glimmer in his eyes, like reeling glowworms. How would you know? I've been here several years running. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that it's not easy to say what's clever and what isn't. No one contradicted him. The sheep were silent again for a while, digesting what they had heard from Fosco. Out in the hall, Beth had stopped talking, and the humans were bleating with agitation. Zora raised her head. What about the wolf? She asked. The wolf is on the inside, said Fosco. Is it like an abyss? Asked Zora. An abyss inside you? Like an abyss, Fosco agreed. Zora thought about it. Falling into an abyss? She could understand that. But falling inside yourself? She shook her head. This is something sheep can't understand, she said. No, said Fosco. No,
It really isn't anything sheep can understand.
Miss Maple had been silent for a long time with her head on one side, thinking. Now she flapped her ears, baffled. Well, it got out, she said at last. Let's go home. The sheep said good-bye to Fosco, who could understand such dark things, and was rightly crowned the smartest sheep in Glenkill year after year. They trotted to the way out at the back that Fosco had shown them. First Othello, then Zora, then Maple, and last of all Mopple the whale. Just as Mopple, with a sense of relief, was about to slip out into the open air behind Maple, a meaty hand came down on the door and closed it gently in front of his nose. Mopple was imprisoned inside the evil-smelling pub. He froze. Beside him sat the butcher, pale-faced, his eyes narrowed to slits. The wheels of his chair smelled of rubber. Mopple looked in all directions. This time there was no escape. Mopple sat down on the cold stone floor with the sheer shock of it. He was in a trap.
You,
said the butcher in a dangerously quiet voice.
You.
Mopple the whale trembled like grass in the wind. All flesh was grass. Ham's hand waved clumsily in the air. Mopple flinched back. For a moment he feared the hand might come off the butcher's arm and leap at him. But Ham just nodded to him, almost respectfully.
Now I understand,
he said.
Now I know I deserved all this. Should have noticed what a bad way he was in. He didn't have any other friend, nor me neither.
Wide-eyed, Mopple stared at the butcher. The butcher's great paw in front of his nose had now clenched into a fist.
But I didn't,
said the butcher.
I just looked away, ignored him. George took that kind of thing to heart.
The butcher's paw shook slightly and then was carefully withdrawn. Mopple felt dizzy. Suddenly, the door in front of his nose was open again. The butcher said no more, but he was watching Mopple with bright eyes. His hands lay limp and lifeless on his thighs. It was some time before Mopple realized what the butcher was waiting for. Then Mopple the whale was in the open air again, dazed. Out there, dark had fallen. Dense, velvety night air, incredibly sweet and clear, streamed into his nostrils. Inspector Holmes watched, stunned, as his case solved itself on the stage of the smartest sheep in Glenkill contest. Suicide. And the business with the spade had been that gray-haired woman's doing. He'd never in his life had thought of that, but in retrospect it didn't seem to him at all implausible. A lonely old man, eccentric, marriage failed, daughter gone. The usual kind of thing. You could never really understand it, though. A quiet, throat-clearing sound nearby brought him out of his thoughts. A man in dark clothes had appeared next to Holmes. Discreet was the word for him, one of the sort you couldn't describe accurately 5 minutes later.
My border collie's name is Murph,
said the man.
Oh, Lord, said Holmes. I might have known it. What do you want now, then? Don't I keep quiet enough for you? Silent as a stone, Inspector. Silent as a stone.
We're really impressed by your masterly inactivity.
What do you think of all that?
Asked Holmes, jerking his chin in the direction of the stage where the gray-haired woman had just stopped talking. The discreet man shrugged. Nothing to do with us. Nothing to do with you either, am I right? Look, how would you like a genuinely successful investigation for once? A successfully solved case of your own? Suddenly, there was a video cassette on the table next to the inspector's Guinness. His glass was already half empty again. Take that away with you, said the man. It'll tell you all about that man McCarthy. Could do your career a bit of good. By the time Holmes had finally stowed the unwieldy cassette in his pocket, the man had long since disappeared. So what? He wouldn't have answered any questions anyway. Holmes stared at the table, where a beer mat promised that Guinness would bring you fame and fortune. There was a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach, and it wasn't just to do with the Glynn case. It was to do with his own life, with the police station, and his certainty that he didn't want to go back there again. He left his glass of Guinness half